The bitter January air hung thick with tension as a group of men huddled in the shadows of Prince Street in Boston's North End. It was January 17, 1950, and after 2 years of meticulous planning, they were finally ready. This wasn't an ordinary group of criminals. These were professional thieves, hardened by years of experience and bound together by a shared desire for one massive score that could set them up for life. The target? The Brinks Armored Car Depot, a fortress of steel and concrete that stored millions of dollars in cash, checks, and securities. Their plan was precise, their nerves steely, but even they couldn't fully grasp the chaos they were about to unleash. In the stillness of that winter evening, the streets were empty. The gang knew the depot's routines, its shift changes, the guards' routes, and even the quirks of the armored vault itself. Inside, an unassuming set of employees was wrapping up the evening count, ready to lock the vault and call it a night. Little did they know that Boston's largest heist was about to unfold. At exactly 7:10 p.m., the gang moved into action. Their faces were obscured by navy pea coats and Halloween masks, eerie in their simplicity. With speed and precision, they filed up the rear stairway leading to the depot, each man carrying a revolver, though they'd agreed to avoid violence unless absolutely necessary. In seconds, they overpowered the unsuspecting employees, expertly binding and gagging them. The terrified guards lay on the floor, barely breathing as they watched the gang work swiftly, methodically. Not a word was spoken, each man knew his role, his every movement part of a well-rehearsed dance. The clock was ticking. They had less than 30 minutes to clean out the depot. With a practiced ease, they drilled into the vault and began emptying the bags of cash and securities, tossing them to one another in near silence. Bundles of bills, unmarked bonds, and envelopes of negotiable instruments piled up in their canvas bags. This wasn't a petty theft. This was a fortune worth over $2.7 million, an unimaginable sum in the 1950s. Outside, the winter night was still, and the streets remained empty, as though fate itself had decided to look the other way. The men worked with military precision, aware that every second counted. The last bags were stuffed, and the leader, a man named Tony Pino, gave the signal. They moved quickly, leaving the scene as quietly as they had come, vanishing into the icy darkness. When the employees finally freed themselves and raised the alarm, it was too late. The police arrived to find the vault ransacked, millions of dollars gone without a trace. It was a clean job. No fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing left behind except for a chilling question. Who could have pulled off such a flawless heist? The media frenzy that followed was unlike anything Boston had seen. Headlines screamed of the crime of the century, and the public was gripped by the audacity of the heist. But as the days turned into weeks and the leads turned cold, frustration mounted within the Boston Police Department. Each suspect they brought in had airtight alibis, and no one in the criminal underworld dared whisper a word about who might have been involved. The FBI joined the investigation, poring over every detail, but the Brinks gang had covered their tracks too well. Every angle was examined, connections to organized crime, ex-military operatives, even disgruntled ex-employees. Yet each lead unraveled just as quickly as it appeared. The stolen cash, if it was even circulating, was nowhere to be found. Months stretched into years, and the Brinks heist took on an almost mythical status. The gang, meanwhile, lay low, careful not to draw any suspicion. They had agreed to wait 7 years before touching the money, knowing that after that time, the statute of limitations would protect them from any charges related to the heist. But as time wore on, paranoia set in. Friends began to turn on one another, certain that someone would crack and betray them all. Tensions mounted, and Tony Pino struggled to keep the gang in line. The FBI was relentless, their pressure unyielding, waiting for one of the gang members to make a mistake. Finally, 5 years after the heist, a former gang member named Joseph Speck O'Keefe cracked. Caught on a minor charge, he was offered a deal, immunity in exchange for details about the heist. O'Keefe knew the gang would never forgive him, but after years of running, hiding, and growing suspicion among his former partners, he had had enough. He confessed to everything, the planning, the roles, the haul. He named names and locations, unraveling the entire scheme. The FBI moved quickly, arresting the remaining gang members and piecing together a case against them. In court, the details of the Brinks heist were laid bare, and the public watched in awe. The trial was a media spectacle, and as each gang member took the stand, they recounted the meticulous planning, the daring execution, and the paranoia that had haunted them afterward. It was the end of an era, and as the sentences were handed down, it became clear that no amount of money was worth the fear and betrayal that had consumed the gang. But even as they were led away, one mystery remained. A significant portion of the stolen money was never recovered. Rumors circulated of hidden caches, of coded maps, and bank accounts under false names. To this day, the Brinks heist stands as both a legendary crime and a cautionary tale. No matter how well you plan, trust and greed are two things no criminal can control. But the story wasn't over just yet. Some of the gang members were still out there, and whispers persisted that not all of them had been caught. Years passed since the trial, but echoes of the Brinks heist still haunted Boston. The city had moved on, but rumors about the lost loot kept the legend alive. Some claimed that the stolen money was buried beneath forgotten city landmarks. Others whispered about offshore accounts set up by Tony Pino himself. Each theory fed the mystery, and the Brinks heist became a cautionary tale of greed, loyalty, and betrayal. In the midst of this lingering intrigue, the FBI remained quietly vigilant. Despite the high-profile arrests, one crucial detail kept nagging at them. They had recovered only a fraction of the stolen $2.7 million. The missing sum became an unsolved piece of the puzzle, an itch that no one could quite scratch. Agents combed through any scrap of information that might reveal where the money had gone, but the Brinks gang had covered their tracks too well. Then, in the winter of 1959, an unexpected break came from an unlikely source. An aging bar owner from the North End, known to the locals as Big Ed, had been a close associate of Tony Pino. Rumor had it that Big Ed had been left out of the heist plan at the last minute, causing a rift between him and Pino. Now, nearly a decade later, Big Ed's loyalty was eroding under the weight of his fading reputation and the lure of an FBI reward. A few late-night conversations, under the haze of cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey, yielded clues that the FBI couldn't ignore. Big Ed mentioned safe houses, coded phrases, and obscure locations that Pino had once shared with him, though he dismissed them as drunken ramblings. One name, in particular, struck a chord with the agents. St. Patrick's. It was a long-abandoned church in Charlestown, a building that had gone unnoticed for years. It seemed a perfect hiding spot, and the FBI decided to investigate. As they approached the crumbling structure, the old church loomed over them like a ghost of the past. Inside, dust coated every surface, but there were clear signs of disturbance. A hollow floorboard, scratch marks around the altar. They began a meticulous search, prying open loose floorboards and scouring hidden nooks. Finally, after hours of searching, they found it. A small, rusted safe tucked away in the crawlspace beneath the altar. The lock was corroded, but it still took careful work to crack it open. Inside were stacks of cash, weathered yet unmistakably part of the Brinks haul. It wasn't the full amount, but it was a significant find, and enough to rekindle the FBI's hopes of closing the case for good. But just as they started celebrating, another question surfaced. If this was only a part of the loot, where was the rest? And more importantly, who else might know about it? The discovery of the hidden cash reignited interest in the heist, and soon the remaining gang members, those who had managed to evade capture or lenient sentences, were thrust back into the spotlight. The FBI discreetly monitored them, hoping that the fresh attention might force someone to slip up or reach out to an old contact. Meanwhile, the Brinks legend took on a new life as treasure hunters, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists descended on Boston, convinced that they could uncover the remaining stash. In the midst of the renewed frenzy, Tony Pino, now in prison, began receiving letters, cryptic, taunting messages hinting at another player in the game. It was clear that someone knew more about the money and was keen on keeping it hidden. Pino, whose paranoia had only grown over the years, felt trapped. The walls were closing in, and the realization struck him like a bolt. Not all of his partners had been as loyal as he'd once thought. Outside the prison walls, another figure lingered in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold. He had been part of the plan from the start, but had remained unseen, a ghost in the background orchestrating every move. And while the rest of Boston scrambled to solve the mystery, he watched with a knowing smirk. The story wasn't over, not yet. The loot, the missing millions, the pieces of the heist left unresolved. They were still his to play with. The mysterious figure, who had stayed hidden in the shadows for so long, was known only by a few as the Ghost. While the gang had been skilled, the Ghost had been the true mastermind, providing key information and plotting each detail with cold precision. Yet he was careful to avoid leaving any traces or putting his name at risk. He had watched the others scramble for power, each one ultimately falling prey to suspicion and greed. They were his pawns, and now, with the recent discoveries and renewed interest, the Ghost knew he had to act quickly. Rumor had it that there was still a second stash of money hidden somewhere in the city. Money only the Ghost knew how to access. And as treasure hunters poured into Boston, scouring old buildings and forgotten hideouts, the Ghost quietly manipulated the frenzy. He left subtle clues, misleading hints planted to throw people off the trail, drawing them to far-off locations and decoy sites that held nothing but dust. Every distraction bought him time to gather what he needed. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Tony Pino wrestled with his growing paranoia. Those letters, the cryptic messages hinting at another figure still free, tormented him day and night. Who was out there, lurking beyond the prison bars, holding on to the rest of the fortune that he had risked everything to steal? His mind spun as he began reliving old conversations and revisiting every betrayal and fight that had erupted within the gang over the years. In a desperate attempt to find answers, Pino decided to reach out to one of his few remaining contacts, a former associate named Frankie, 2x Mancini. Frankie had kept a low profile, but he owed Pino a favor from years back and still respected the old code of silence. Through a carefully arranged chain of messages, Pino got a letter to Frankie, urging him to dig into the sudden resurgence of interest around the Brinks Hall. Frankie, who had kept his distance from the heist and all its chaos, reluctantly agreed to help. He began asking questions, piecing together fragments from both legitimate and underworld sources. It didn't take long before Frankie picked up on a name that struck him as odd, a name that had been whispered around Boston's crime circles for years but had always been a phantom: the Ghost. With his nerves steeled and curiosity piqued, Frankie dove deeper, pulling on threads that others had ignored. What he uncovered was chilling. There were traces of the Ghost scattered across other unsolved cases: bank robberies, heists, high-stakes smuggling operations, each one left without leads, each one with a small fortune that seemed to vanish into thin air. It was as if this figure moved through the city like a shadow, staying just out of reach but leaving a trail of carefully orchestrated chaos in his wake. As Frankie's investigation neared dangerous territory, he found himself under constant surveillance. Each step he took, he sensed he was being watched. He knew he was close to something big, something that could change everything about the Brinks heist. But before he could piece it all together, he received a note in his apartment, slipped under the door in the dead of night. The note read simply, "Back off, Frankie, or the next whisper you hear will be your own." The Ghost was onto him. Rattled, Frankie decided it was time to bring Pino up to speed. Through a covert message, he warned Pino that someone more powerful, more calculating, was still out there and had been pulling strings from the start. But as the message made its way to the prison, an unexpected complication arose. The FBI had intercepted a tip about Pino's ongoing communications and began monitoring his every move. They were determined to uncover any lingering secrets about the missing money and weren't about to let him out of their sights. Knowing his messages were now compromised, Pino grew increasingly desperate. Every avenue to the outside world was closing fast, and he realized he had only one option left. He needed to escape. Pino began to plan, quietly gathering allies inside the prison, looking for weaknesses in the routines, and identifying guards who could be bribed. His mind was sharp as ever, driven by the knowledge that if he could only get out, he could get to Frankie, and maybe, finally, get the answers he'd spent years searching for. But the ghost was always one step ahead. With each passing day, Pino's determination grew. He meticulously crafted his escape plan, a quiet rebellion masked by his routine, waiting for the moment to slip through the cracks. Time was against him. Every delay only brought more scrutiny from the FBI. But he knew his only chance lay outside these walls, where he could confront Frankie and unravel the enigma that had haunted him since the Brinks Heist. Meanwhile, the ghost moved with a purpose, sensing the heightened activity around Boston as a low but insistent hum. He remained in the shadows, yet his unseen hand touched everything. By leaking hints and fabricating dead ends, he controlled the chase, manipulating both law enforcement and treasure hunters like pieces on a board. The ghost's power was his invisibility, and it had served him well. To everyone who sought him, he was no more than a figment, a whispered legend. But he knew that legends could be dangerous if left unchecked. Back in the prison, the night of Pino's escape finally arrived. His allies had coordinated a distraction on the other side of the yard, drawing the guards' attention. As chaos erupted, Pino slipped through an unsecured gate, heart pounding, each step taking him closer to freedom. Under the cover of darkness, he vanished into the night, retracing his old haunts and avoiding any place too familiar. He knew that he had little time. Once word got out, the manhunt would begin. The next morning, a message awaited Frankie, left in his usual safe spot. "Meet me tonight." Same place as before. It was unsigned, but he knew it was from Pino. Nervous but resolute, Frankie made his way to an old warehouse they had once used for late-night meetings. As he entered the dark, echoing space, his footsteps felt heavier than usual, as if the shadows themselves held a secret. Pino emerged from behind a stack of crates, his face worn and haunted but with an intensity in his eyes that hadn't faded. Without a word, he grabbed Frankie by the shoulders. "You found him, didn't you? The ghost?" he whispered, his voice a mixture of anger and anticipation. Frankie nodded, glancing around. "I didn't think you'd make it out, Tony," he muttered, voice low. "But listen, this goes deeper than we thought. The ghost isn't just some partner we never met. He's been watching us, keeping tabs on everyone involved in the heist. Even those of us who never knew his name." Pino's grip tightened. He sensed the truth of Frankie's words. "Where is he now?" Frankie shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know he's on to me. The warning I got, it's real. This guy has eyes everywhere. I think he's closer to us than we realized. Like he's right under our noses." Just as Pino began to press him for more, they heard footsteps. Their instincts kicked in, and they fell silent, retreating into the shadows. A lone figure entered, backlit against the warehouse door. They couldn't see his face, but his calm stance and the casual way he entered made it clear that this wasn't a simple trespasser. The figure stepped further into the dim light, and as he did, the glint of a gun tucked under his coat caught their eyes. The silence stretched, thick with tension, as the man spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You've been looking for me, haven't you?" The realization hit them both. This was him, the ghost. The room seemed to shrink as Pino and Frankie faced the man who had haunted them for nearly a decade. The ghost's presence was chilling, a quiet, composed power that unnerved even the most hardened criminals. He took a step forward, his gaze cold, assessing. The dim light caught the sharp angles of his face, revealing a figure unburdened by guilt or fear. Pino felt a surge of anger mixed with curiosity. After all these years, he'd expected a mastermind, someone larger than life. Instead, the ghost looked disarmingly ordinary, a face easily lost in a crowd. "You've been playing us," Pino said, his voice a harsh whisper. "Why? What was the point of all this?" The ghost's mouth curled into a faint smile. "Power, Mr. Pino. Power and control. You thought the heist was about money, but money is fleeting. Real power is what remains. I needed people like you to execute the plan, and you did brilliantly. But once the job was done, you became a liability." Frankie, still in shock, found his voice. "So you kept the money for yourself and let us rot?" His voice trembled with both anger and fear. The ghost shrugged. Some of it, yes. But I used it to expand, to grow the network, to maintain control. And all the while, I've watched you scramble, watched you look for answers you'll never find. You were all so eager, so hungry. I simply gave you a stage to play out your ambitions. Pinot's fists clenched. He was known for his cunning, but in this moment, he felt helpless against the calculated calm of the man before him. You think you can just show up here and walk away? The FBI is on your trail now. They're breathing down everyone's necks. The ghost's gaze darkened. The FBI doesn't concern me. They're too focused on finding the remainder of the money, and I've ensured that they'll keep finding just enough to keep them busy. They'll never get close to me, and neither will you. A cold silence followed his words. Frankie could feel the weight of the ghost's warning, the chilling certainty that this man held all the cards. Pinot, however, refused to back down. He took a step forward, the faint glint of desperation in his eyes. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Pinot's voice was low, dangerous. But even the best plans unravel. You taught us how to survive, how to think 2 steps ahead. You can't control us forever. The ghost regarded him for a moment, almost as if he pitied him. True, even the best plans have flaws. But I don't need forever, Pinot. Just long enough for you to make a mistake. And you will. Eventually, everyone does. With that, the ghost turned, his footsteps echoing as he disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Pinot and Frankie paralyzed with a mixture of anger and dread. The impact of his words hung over them. A warning, a promise, and a declaration of his unshakable power. As the silence returned, Pinot's mind raced. He was no longer willing to wait, to let the ghost dictate the rules of the game. But he knew he couldn't face him alone. He needed allies, resources, and a plan that matched the ghost's ruthlessness. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was a war for survival, and Pinot was determined to turn the tables. In the dimly lit warehouse, Pinot and Frankie locked eyes. They understood each other without words. A silent pact, born from desperation and anger. If they were going to take down the ghost, it would require every ounce of cunning and resilience they had. And this time, they wouldn't let him slip away so easily. Pinot and Frankie knew they were up against a formidable adversary. Their only advantage was desperation, the kind of reckless determination that had gotten them into the Brinks Heist to begin with. Over the following months, they worked in secret, contacting former allies, tracking down any rumors about the ghost's whereabouts, and leaving messages that would draw him out of hiding. They used every trick he'd taught them, every lesson he drilled into them, becoming ghosts themselves as they moved through the underbelly of Boston. Then, one night, they received a tip the ghost was hosting a high-stakes, underground meeting with his most trusted lieutenants. It was the break they'd been waiting for. Pinot and Frankie armed themselves and slipped into the shadows, moving silently, their resolve unshakable. As they approached the meeting spot, the sound of the ghost's voice drifted through the air, calm and controlled, as if he hadn't a care in the world. With a final look of determination, they burst into the room, guns raised, catching the ghost and his associates by surprise. A tense standoff ensued, with both sides unwilling to back down. In that final confrontation, Pinot realized the truth. He and the ghost were alike, each driven by ambition, cunning, and pride. But where the ghost sought power through manipulation, Pinot had learned the cost of betrayal, the price of selfish ambition. He knew then that winning this battle didn't mean taking the ghost's life, but walking away from the cycle of greed and violence that had trapped them all. Without firing a shot, Pinot turned to Frankie and nodded. They left the ghost there, a silent declaration that they wouldn't play his game anymore. They knew the ghost might still haunt them, but they were free, no longer puppets in his twisted game. The Brinks Heist had shown them the allure of wealth and power, but in the end, it was the ability to choose their own paths that mattered most. They walked out of the building and into the night, determined to live life on their terms. Moral: true freedom comes not from wealth or power but from the strength to walk away from toxic ambition and live with integrity.